Well, there's not much sleeping done in the flood district during the spring flood. The gas was shut off, and I gave Mr. Reynolds and the Ladleys each a lamp. I sat in the back room that I had made into a temporary kitchen with a candle, and with a bed quilt around my shoulders, I just sat. The water rose fast now in the lower hall. By midnight it was at the seventh step. I always have a skiff during flood season, and as the water rose, I tied one to a spindle of the staircase so that if my guests needed to go out, they could. I made myself a cup of tea, and at 1 o'clock I stretched out on the sofa for a few hours' sleep. I think I had only been sleeping an hour or so when someone touched me on the shoulder and I started. It was Mr. Reynolds, partly dressed. "Someone's been in the house, Mrs. Pittman. They went away just now with the boat." Half asleep, I said, "Perhaps it was Peter. That dog is always wandering around." Mr. Reynolds said dryly, "Not unless Peter can row a boat." And so I got up. Being already fully dressed and taking the candle, we went to the staircase. I noticed that it was a minute or two after 2 o'clock when we left the room. And the boat was gone. Not untied, but cut loose. The end of the rope was still fastened to the stair rail, and I sat down on the stairs and looked at Mr. Reynolds. "It's gone. If the house catches fire, we might have to drown." It's rather curious when you consider it. We both spoke softly, not to disturb the Ladleys. "I've been awake and I heard no boat come in. And yet if no one came in by boat, and they came from the street, they would have had to have swam in." Well, I felt queer and creepy. The street door was open, of course, and the lights going beyond, and it gave me a strange feeling to sit there in the darkness on the stairs, with the arch of the front door like an entrance to a cavern. I'd see now and then a chunk of ice slide into view, turn around in an eddy, and pass on. It was bitter cold, and the wind was rising. Well, I'll go through the house. There's likely nothing worse the matter than some drunken mill hand on vacation while the mills are underwater. But I'd better look. And so he left me, and I sat there alone in the darkness. I had a presentiment of something wrong, but I tried to think it was only the discomfort of the cold. The water, driven in by the wind, swirled at my feet, and something dark floated in and lodged itself on the step below my feet. I reached down and touched it, only to discover it was a dead kitten. I had never known a dead cat to bring me anything but bad luck, and here was one washed at my very feet. Mr. Reynolds came back soon and reported that the house was quiet and in order. "However," he said, "I found Peter shut up in one of the third-floor rooms. Did you put him up there?" Well, I had not, and I said so. But as the dog went everywhere and the door might have blown shut, we didn't attach much importance to it at the time. Well, the skiff was gone, and there was no use worrying about it until morning, so I went back to my sofa to keep warm. But I left the candle lit and my door open. But I did not sleep. That dead cat was on my mind, and as if it were not bad enough to have it washed in at my feet at 4 in the morning, Peter, prowling uneasily, discovered it, and then brought it up and put it on my couch, wet and stiff, right next to me. I looked at the clock, and it was now 4:15. And except for the occasional crunch of an ice cake hitting one another, everything was quiet. And then I heard the stealthy sound of oars in the lower hall. Well, I'm not brave. I lay there hoping Mr. Reynolds would hear it and open his door. But he was sleeping soundly. Peter snarled and ran down the hall, and the next moment I heard Mr. Ladley speaking. "Down, Peter, down! Go and lie down!" Well, I took my candle and went out into the hall, and Mr. Ladley was stooping over the boat, trying to tie it to the staircase. The rope was short, having been cut, and he was having trouble. Perhaps it was the candlelight, but he looked ghost white and haggard. I borrowed your boat, Mrs. Pittman, he said, civilly enough. Mrs. Ladley was not well, and I went to the drugstore. Well, you've been more than 2 hours at the drugstore, I said. He muttered something about not finding any open at first, and then went into his room, closed and locked the door behind him. And although Peter whined and scratched, he would not let him in. He looked so agitated that I thought maybe I had been harsh, and perhaps she really was ill. I knocked at the door and asked if there was anything I could do, but he only called, "No!" and asked me to take that infernal dog away. So there was nothing more for it, so I went back to bed and tried to sleep. The water began to drop, and I knew the danger was over. Peter came out shivering at dawn and got on the sofa with me. I put the end of the quilt over him, and he stopped shivering after a time and went to sleep. The dog was company, but I lay there wide awake, thinking about Mr. Pittman's death, and how I had come by degrees to be keeping a cheap boarding house in the flood district, and to having to take impudence from everybody who chose to rent a room for me, and being called a she-devil. To think I grew up on Penn Avenue. From that I got to thinking again about the Ladleys, and how she said he was a fiend. I began to doubt that he might have gone out to get medicine for her, but I wasn't sure, and so I dozed off again, and at daylight I woke up after sleeping heavily. At 7 o'clock, Mr. Reynolds came to the door, dressed for the store. Mr. Reynolds was a tall man of about 50, neat and orderly in his habits, and he always remembered that I had seen better days and treated me as a lady. "Never mind about breakfast for me this morning, Mrs. Pittman," he said. "I'll get a cup of coffee on the other end of the bridge. I'll take the boat out and send it back with Terry." And he turned and he went along the hall and down to the boat, and I heard him push off at the bottom of the stairs with an oar and row out into the street. Peter followed him to the flood line and waited. At 7:15, Mr. Ladley came out and called for me. "Just bring a cup of coffee and some toast. Enough for one." And he went back and slammed the door. I made his coffee and steeped a cup of tea for Mrs. Ladley at the same time. He opened the door just wide enough for the tray and took it without so much as a thank you. He had a cigarette in his mouth as usual, and I could see a fire in the grate and the smell of something scorched. "Well, I hope Mrs. Ladley is better," I said, getting my foot in the crack of the door so he could not quite close it. It smelled to me as if he had accidentally set fire to something with his cigarette, and I wanted to see around the room. "Well, what about Mrs. Ladley?" "Well, you said she was ill last night." "Oh, yes. Well, she wasn't very sick. She's better now." "Shall I bring her tea?" "Take your foot away. She doesn't want your tea. She's not here." "Not here? Good heavens! Is her going away without anything to make a fuss about? Lord knows I'll be glad to get out of this infernal pig wallow myself." "If you mean my house," I began. But he pulled himself together and was more polite when he answered. "Sorry, I mean the neighborhood. Your house is all it could be desired for, considering the money. If we do not have linen sheets and double cream, well, we're paying muslin and milk prices." Either way, my nose was growing accustomed to the odor, or it was dying away, and so I took my foot away from the door. "When did Mrs. Ladley leave?" "This morning, very early. I rode her out to Federal Street." "Well, you couldn't have had much sleep," I said dryly, for he looked horrible. There were lines around his eyes, which were red, and his lips looked dry and cracked. "She's not in the piece this week at the theater. She's gone away. She'll be back next Saturday." But I didn't believe him, nor do I think he imagined that I did. But he shut the door in my face nonetheless. He shut it so fast that it caught poor Peter by the nose, and the dog ran off howling. And although Mr. Ladley had been fond of the animal, as it was his nature to be fond, he paid no attention. I started down the hall after Peter, and I saw what Peter had been carrying in his mouth. It was a slipper of Mrs. Ladley's, soaked with water. Evidently, Peter had found it floating at the foot of the stairs. I have to say that, although the idea of murder had not entered my head at this time, the slipper gave me a turn. I picked it up and looked at it, a black one with a beaded toe, short in the vamp and high-heeled, the sort most actresses wear. So I went back and knocked at the door of his room again. "What the devil do you want now?" "Here's a slipper of Mrs. Ladley's. Peter found it floating in the lower hall." He opened the door wide and let me in. The room was in tolerable order, much better than when Mrs. Ladley was about. He looked at the sleeper. He looked at the slipper, but he wouldn't touch it. "I don't think it's hers." "Well, I've seen her wear it 100 times." "Well, she'll never wear it again." And then, seeing me stare, he added, "Well, it's ruined with the water. Throw it out. And by the way, I'm sorry I set fire to one of your pillow slips. Dropped asleep with a cigarette. Just put it on my bill." He pointed to the bed when one of the pillows had no slip. I went over to have a look at it. "The pillow will have to be paid for too, Mr. Ladley. And you know there's a sign nailed to the door that forbids smoking in bed. If you're really going to set fire to things, I'm going to have to charge extra." "Really?" he jeered, looking at me with his cold fish eyes. "Is there any sign on the door that says boarders are charged extra for 7 feet of filthy river water in their bedrooms?" was never a match for him, and I make it principle never to bandy words with my boarders, so I took the pillow and the slip and went out. The telephone was ringing on the stair. It was the theater. They were asking for Miss Brice. Well, she's gone away, I said. What do you mean, moved away? Gone for a few days' vacation. She isn't playing this week, is she? Wait a moment, said the voice, and there was the hum of conversation at the other end. And then a man came to the telephone. Can you tell me where Miss Brice is gone? Well, I'll see. I went to the Ladley's door and knocked, and Mr. Ladley answered from just beyond. The theater's asking where Mrs. Ladley is. Tell them I don't know. I took his message to the telephone, and whoever it was swore and hung up the receiver. All the morning I was uneasy, and I hardly knew why. But Peter felt it as I did. There was no sound from the Ladleys' room, and the house was quiet except for the lapping of water on the stairs and the police patrol going back and forth in the boats. At 11 o'clock, a boy in the neighborhood, paddling on a raft, fell into the water and drowned. I watched the police boat go past, carrying his little cold body. And after that, I was good for nothing. I went and sat with Peter on the stairs. The dog's conduct had been strange all morning. He sat just above the water, looking at it, whimpering. I thought dryly, maybe he's expecting another kitten. It's hard to say how ideas first enter one's mind, but the notion that Mr. Ladley had killed his wife and thrown her body into the water came to me as I sat there, all at once. I seemed to see it all, the quarreling of the day, the night trip in the boat, the water-soaked slipper, his haggard face, even the way the Saniel spat and stared at the flood. Terry brought the boat back at 11:30, towing it behind another. Well, I hope you've had a pleasant morning, I said. What doing? Well, rowing about the streets, I said. You've had that boat for hours. He tied it up without a word to me, but he spoke to the dog. Good morning, Peter. It's nice weather for fishes, ain't it? He picked out a bit of floating wood from the water and showed it to the dog and then flung it into the parlor. And Peter went after it with a splash. He was pretty fat, and when he came back I heard him wheezing. But what he brought back was not the stick of wood. It was the knife I used for cutting bread. It had been on the shelf in the room where I had slept the night before, and now Peter brought it out of the flood, where its wooden handle had kept it afloat. But the blade was broken off. Now, it's not unusual to find one's household goods floating around during flood time. More than once I've lost a chair or two, and then seen it after the water had gone down, newly scrubbed and painted, in Molly McGuire's kitchen right next door. Perhaps now and then, with a bit of luck, something might even come to me. A dog kennel, or a chicken house, or a kitchen table, or even, as once happened, a month-old baby in a wooden cradle that lodged against my back fence. It had come 40 miles, as it turned out, with no worse mishap than a cold. But the knife was different. I had put it on the mantel over the stove I was using upstairs the night before and hadn't touched it since. As I sat staring at it, Peter took it, Terry took it from Peter and handed it to me. "Better give me a penny, Mrs. Pittman," he said in his imprudent way. "I hate to give you a knife. It may cut our friendship." I reached over to hit him with a clout on the head, but I didn't. The sunlight was coming in through the window at the top of the stairs and shining on the rope that was tied to the banister. And it was only then that I noticed that the end of the rope was covered with stains, brown, and a glint of red. I got up shivering. "You can get the meat at the butcher's, Terry, and come back for me in a half an hour." And then I turned and went upstairs, weak in the knees, to put on my hat and coat. I had made up my mind. There had been a murder done here.